Okay, we're at 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. We're going live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this afternoon session. We are featuring Professor Alina, Professor of Clinical Law at NYU, and she is the author of No Justice in the Shadows, How America Criminalizes Immigrants. Matthew Archambault is an attorney in Philadelphia, and Stephen Robbins is an attorney in Yakima. Together, Matthew and Stephen host a really great immigration law and policy podcast called Redirect. My name is Tony Lee. I'm a third-year law student at the University of Idaho here in Boise, and a volunteer with Immigrant Justice Idaho. Just before we get started, a reminder to everyone who is in the webinar that you can only see the panelists, obviously, and if you would like to input questions into the chat box, I will do my best to interject and present them to our really wonderful speakers. That's it for me. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Great.
Thank you, Anthony.
Well, we have a podcast. I mean, I don't know that it's all those other things that you said, but this is really exciting, Matthew.
Finally.
Be talking to, here's the book, proof that I have it. And
love to see it.
Yes, I did all the homework. Professor Das, tell us a little bit about the book.
Sure. So yes, I also have my prop. See, so the book is called No Justice in the Shadows: How America Criminalizes.
Hold on just a second, Matthew.
Yeah, I don't have the book with me.
All right,
Matthew.
This is what I've been reading lately. So.
Oh, boring.
Oh,
sorry.
It's on my bedstand.
Wow.
Sorry.
Well,
And I actually thought this was tomorrow, so I don't know.
it's all right. It's available at your local bookstores, by independent, and at libraries. So the book is really a book, as the title says, No Justice in the Shadows. I talk about that title in part because I think we spend so much time talking about how immigrants need to come out of the shadows that we don't spend enough time talking about why the shadows exist in the first place. And the criminalization of immigrants is really intentional. So the book is tracing that history, why we target immigrants, why we rely so heavily on the criminal legal system to target immigrants, and then using stories of some of my clients, people that I've had the privilege of representing along with my students at NYU Law School. We are really trying to unpack the system, this deportation pipeline, and explain why deportation policy shouldn't be thought of as a tool for protecting public safety, that it really does the opposite, that it harms our communities, and that we need to really dismantle the deportation machinery and also untangle the connection between the criminal legal system and the deportation system.
And actually, thank you so much for the book, because so much is spent on, so many advocates, and I think maybe well-meaning people who want to talk about, like the perfect immigrant, that DACA student who's a valedictorian, and they'll want to kind of keep the people that you're talking about kind of out of the conversation. And, so my favorite clients have been those with criminal backgrounds, and not only minor criminal backgrounds, some pretty serious stuff. But as a society, we have to kind of decide like how we want to treat people. Do we want to treat people with grace, or do we want to be punitive for everything? And I'm glad that you're speaking about it, because there is like so much value to I think everyone has something to offer of value, and so often that value is so greatly diminished because of maybe a DUI that someone had 20 years ago, or quite frankly even maybe a more serious crime. But everyone deserves some grace in something. I'm glad that you're talking about it.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. I think it's one of those things where it's understandable. Like people who have grown up in immigrant communities, immigrant households, we've lived our whole lives being told that we're lucky to be here, that we have to work hard and earn our place in this country. And while I understand those sentiments, I grew up with those sentiments, at the end of the day, it distracts us from the reality of really figuring out why is it so difficult to immigrate here in the first place? Why do we have these rules? And why are immigrants so often treated as suspects, treated as people who are always going to be perpetual outsiders and threats, having to prove ourselves? And that mentality, even if you do everything right, even if you are the valedictorian, that mentality is still what keeps immigrant communities from really thriving in the United States. And I think we've obviously seen that under the Trump administration. He has used every trope in the book to talk about immigrants as criminals, as people who are just draining the public coffers. He's using all of those descriptions, and it demonstrates how being the valedictorian, being the perfect person is not enough to save you. And so part of the reason I wrote this book is to say, like, we're not going to really see progress if we keep allowing our own communities to be divided into good and bad. And that we have to really shift the focus back to the government and why these policies exist in the first place. And a lot of what I talk about in the book is how it's really driven from racism, from anti-Blackness, from these kind of foundational principles that back in the day were really explicit, that we have these immigration laws in order to preserve whiteness at the foundations of the US when it's first being formed. And that continues to this day, even when we're not being so explicit about it.
I want to play a clip real quick of this guy. You guys can't see it, but folks on YouTube can see it. Joe Biden, you might remember him. He was confronted by some protesters at some point during the campaign. I guess I could have researched that. It looks like it was about a year ago. And he was asked to apologize for the 3 million deportations that he was part of as vice president. He refused to do that. And then he was asked to commit to stopping all deportations. And this is what he had to say.
I want to know if you will commit to stopping all deportations if you are elected president.
No. I will not all deportations or detention. I would make sure that every single...
Will you apologize for the 3 million deportations under the Obama administration?
No. What I will...
3 million deportations under the Obama administration!
I think I missed the clip. That's a classic redirect move. What he says is that he obviously, in his mind, very obviously would not stop the deportation of felons. That's an obvious thing. Why on earth would you do that? But if you have a misdemeanor, then okay, right? Then like he's maybe willing to give you some space. And it does feel like that's almost a reflexive type of position for people to have. Talk about the flaws in that type of thinking and why people who feel that way might want to rethink their position.
Sure. So, and I think it really is a signature part of the past Obama-Biden administration. And Obama said it best himself in his 2014 speech, where he said we should be deporting felons and not families, right? It's like this divide that exists in people's heads, but it doesn't exist in real life. And these are some of the stories that I tell in my book. One of the chapters follows the story of a woman named Abba in the book. And Abba is this woman who is dropping her 4-year-old off at school. And as she turns out of the building, this is in the Bronx, New York, and it's in the Obama years. She turns out of the building and suddenly she sees these officers surrounding her, and they're holding up a picture, and it's a picture of her from the worst day of her life. It's 8 years prior, when she was arrested and eventually convicted of a felony. And so she's that person, right, that the past administration, the Obama-Biden administration, was talking about, deport felons, not families. But when you look at her, right, so yes, she has a felony conviction. For her, it was, she was pregnant with her third child. She was about to be evicted from her home. She asked her boss if she could get some money, an advance on her paycheck to pay the rent. He said no. And so she made the choice to take some money from her boss, thinking that she would put it back the next week and that no one would notice. He noticed, he called the police, she was arrested. The police actually saw, this is in New York, the police saw her and they were like, oh, wow, this is an 8-month pregnant woman who's about to be evicted. We're not actually going to take her to jail. She ends up getting probation, but she does plead to a felony. And as a result, she spends the next 5 years paying back every cent she took. And it's the biggest shame in her life. But she does what the criminal legal system asked her to do. And she actually got a little modicum of forgiveness in that system, which is a surprise. And there she is, 8 years later, living her life, taking care of her U.S. citizen children, and she is arrested by ICE and taken away to a jail. And, you know, for those kids, she was too ashamed. She didn't want the kids to come see her in jail. She had never been in jail before. And so the first time those kids saw her was when we were forced as her lawyers to bring them to court because we knew the judge deciding for bond needed to see the kids to make a decision. And we were lucky enough to have fought for a decision at the time that gave her the right to the bond hearing because of her felony, she's actually not eligible for a bond hearing. But we were able to have that day in court. We brought those kids, and that 4-year-old saw his mother for the first time wearing a uniform, a jumpsuit, with her feet shackled. And he cried so hard that the judge ordered him out of the courtroom, ordered his dad to take him out of the courtroom. And when I think about that, you know, she was granted bond. She eventually was able to get her green card through this process. And I think about that and the harm it created to that family. You know, government policies, immigration policies, like at a minimum, they should be producing good, solving problems. But all I see, especially when people get this double punishment on top of an old criminal conviction and they're put in the system, is harm. It's just taking someone after they've gotten their life together, disrupting it all over again, and harming their families and communities in the process. I'm hoping that Biden is willing to learn, and I think we've heard a little bit in more recent conversations and in the last debate, perhaps an acknowledgement that mistakes were made and things need to change. And so I trust in our communities to push him to do better this time around, again, with the footnote being that we don't know yet that he's getting this time around, but that's my hope.
Well,
yeah, I think one thing that will go around with when immigration lawyers are talking to each other, just kind of commiserating about cases. You know, they'll always say like, oh, you know, they'll have a client and they'll say, have you ever been arrested? And they'll say no. And then you do a little research and you say, hey, what about that time back in 2005 when you were arrested for whatever? And they're like, oh yeah, but I took care of that. I paid all of that. And we kind of laugh like, yeah, but you were arrested. Like we have to put that down. But they are right. I mean, they're not, from a moral standpoint, they paid it all. They did what they had to do. But now we're there to remind them, okay, it might be 15 years later, and now you have to account for that again. And Alina, as you say, they can be totally different people at that time. And so, that is real frustrating. And like, I don't share that much optimism with Biden that he's going to fix this part. I saw one tweet where some legal analysis said, oh, rest assured, Biden is going to do XXX, whatever, with immigration. And I think as a community, like, we cannot rest assured of anything. So I think it's up to all of us to, push on these parts. And I think your book is a good starting point.
Yeah, no, and I think that's part of the lesson that we got from the Obama years is that we all gave President Obama a lot of space in the beginning to do what we thought he was going to do, right? Like to put an immigration plan forward, to really create opportunities. And instead, he did this kind of political gamble where he said, if I want to create that political space, so I'm going to be really tough on folks. I'm going to deport, they'll go after the worst of the worst. I'm going to expand programs like Secure Communities, which is like this fingerprinting program that shares people's data if they're arrested for anything, no matter what happens. Like used all of this machinery, expanded the machinery of deportation. And we never got what was supposed to come out of that bargain, which is some sort of, okay, well, now we can actually talk about real immigration reform. We just got more deportations. So I think we learned that lesson. And with the Biden administration, like they saw the result. They saw the backlash among communities, particularly communities of color in the US. And so I'm hoping that if there's a Biden administration, if we keep up the pressure from the beginning and create that space, that we can make more progress. But I agree. I don't think anything is guaranteed, and it's really up to us to make sure that we don't get a similar reaction. Like, give us time. Like, we don't want to do anything controversial. Like, I think that will just lead to increases in deportation. It will make it much harder to not only reverse some of the worst policies under the Trump administration, but to prevent them from happening again. You have to really kind of take apart the machinery so the next person also doesn't come along and expand it. So I'm hoping there'll be some meeting of minds around that idea. And I will say that Trump has done a good job of illustrating how horrible agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and CBP, and all of the other federal agencies and sub-agencies within that have been, and brought that to the public eye a lot more than we've seen in previous years.
Yeah. I'm curious, again, just to bring it back to this question about like changing minds, because I feel like so many people are going to be so quick to compromise. Like, there's immigration reform, and they want to say, if you've ever had a DUI, then you're outside of whatever 12-year conditional residency they want to propose or something like that. And I think so many people are going to be quick to cede that ground. And so I'm wondering, you gave a good example of somebody in very sympathetic circumstances, obviously, 8 months pregnant and rent due. But what other kinds of things can we take to our friends or family who, they're not dealing with immigrants? And I'll be honest, a lot of my views on this have changed because of like being in the trenches with somebody and spending hours and hours developing declarations and getting to know them. And most regular people don't have the opportunity to do that. So, like, how do we do the work of changing minds on this when the opportunity comes around to get something done?
Yeah, so I think some of the work that I think has given me hope is the work we do in elevating people's stories, as you mentioned, on the ground. And by the way to do that, I think, is really to support local organizing. I mean, we're seeing a little microcosm of it right now as the election results are playing out, in that, we've been all looking at Arizona, for example, and seeing the potential for change there. And people have been really tying it to local organizing on the ground for years under Sheriff Joe Arpaio, right? So you have groups like Puente, like Lucha, like Mi Gente, who are really born out of this, like, show me your papers, the Arpaio, like, parading around people in his jails in tent cities in like pink underwear, like this real demonization of people as criminals. And you did see a backlash, right? Like, it became that obvious to people on the ground. And when the people who were picked up by the police, when their kids got older, right? They're the youth who are organizing and have been organizing in Arizona and are part of the reason why, we're seeing parts of that state turn blue and possibly these election results, right? And so to me, that shows that, like, when families feel supported and safe enough to speak out, when they can share their own stories, when the media is willing to listen, when communities are willing to fund legal services so people can stay together and be supported, when the organizations themselves are funded and supported by communities, and not just the mainstream groups in DC that often are setting the tone for policy changes. When we center that local organizing, I think the stories come out naturally, because that's been the lived experience of people of color for decades. And in some of the places where it felt hopeless, like, you think about how many times Sheriff Joe was reelected before he was finally ousted. And then that base, continues to this day, and fighting back against the state legislation and all of that. I think that's what gives me hope that people can change their minds, that they see that this overreach. The other thing I think is the movement for Black lives. Generally speaking, the country is in a much better place than it was 5-10 years ago, and just being educated about the systemic racism in our criminal legal system. And so it's a hard leap, but it shouldn't be, for people to then see, well, if you believe that aspects of the criminal legal system are fundamentally racist, that Black people, Latinx people are arrested and convicted and sentenced for much longer, disproportionate times, even though there's no difference in crime rates, whatnot, all of the statistics and the data, the research about the geography of policing, if you believe that, you can start to see that, and you can see that violence that communities experience when there's just an overfunding of policing and under-resourcing of other communities. And then you start to see the deportation system just kind of tacked onto that. Maybe you'll start to feel more sympathy and more empathy for the idea that a person who survived the criminal legal system to then just be placed into the deportation system and exiled from their home, maybe that will also create change through a racial justice lens. But the combination of those things, I think, can create the conditions for change. But there will need to be a narrative shift, and in some cases, really a shift in our attention away from like the pundits and the folks who've been setting the tone in Washington and towards like communities that have been demanding what they need for themselves.
Right.
I do see a question, and I think it might be an apt question. And it says, what are your thoughts on abolishing ICE?
So in favor, I'm giving a thumbs up for listeners. But what does that mean? What does abolishing ICE mean, right? Like, I think that's really the struggle. So some people hear it and think it's just like completely out there. Like, what does it mean to abolish a federal agency? Federal agencies get abolished all the time. People propose the abolishment of all sorts of different agencies. It's routine, and ICE itself.
But ICE is has a long and historic presence in our country, right? I mean, they've been around since like the founding, I think. Sure.
Well, in some ways they have. The agency itself obviously is relatively new, as part of the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002 into 2003. So the agency itself, that formation is new and therefore can totally be restructured without as much chaos as one might think. But yeah, the concept actually, people aren't wrong when they say, but no, ICE has been around forever. In a way it has, since the creation of federal immigration law, and really since the emphasis on Chinese exclusion, that's when you started to see this idea of needing a federal agency to enforce immigration law. And it's actually been interesting to see how it moves from Department of Labor, Department of Commerce into Department of Treasury. And then you start to see, okay, Department of Justice and now Department of Homeland Security. It's kind of like a metaphor for what we think of immigrants over time. And so I think the main issue is that we don't need a federal agency whose job it is to criminalize immigrants, to screen them as threats, to exile them from the country. What would it look like if we had a federal agency that was focused on helping immigrants come to the United States, helping them thrive here, providing humanitarian assistance, providing support that people need to move? And when people think that seems like a radical idea, it's really, again, about like class and race. Like, if you are a rich, white person from any of the richest countries in the world, you already have open borders. You're already able to take your passport and travel anywhere you want for any reason. We allow money and labor to flow freely, right? And the question is, why do we then create a system that's designed to exploit people, to make it so hard for certain groups to come here, rather than just accepting that we need to identify what the actual problems are and regulate those problems, not people, but the actual issues. We care about workers' rights and protecting American workers. people should be on an even playing field. We shouldn't have whole classes of people excluded just because they weren't born here. If we care about public safety, and I think about this often with my clients who've had contact in the criminal legal system, rather than spending thousands of dollars to deport someone after they finally got drug treatment, got back on their feet, and are now, becoming a counselor to people in their community, why not actually put that money into drug treatment so they didn't have this issue in the first place? I think we're using immigration to distract ourselves from the real problems that we have a genuine need to be worried about, and having a whole agency devoted to policing immigrants, particularly in the interior of this country, I think just demonstrates how we're diverting our resources into an agency that's really, been a very rogue agency and has caused a lot of pain in communities, and really doesn't have anything to show for themselves in terms of problems that they've solved and solutions that they've given to the American people.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if when people came in, they were able to get things like work permits so they could get driver's licenses, and think about that, like how many of our clients get into criminal issues because they don't have a driver's license, right? Or they're having to, work unlawfully, like Stephen's client has to go out and get a fake Social Security card. But yeah, I mean, I think most of ICE's things that they do that we recognize, they don't really need to do. We don't need them to do that. Whenever you get in this conversation long enough with someone, they'll talk about like sex trafficking and all that. And okay, I mean, we can keep them for maybe those isolated things, but I don't think as an agency we really need them anymore. I know Stephen's a big fan, right? Big shout out to all the people in his ERO field office.
Yeah. I had a colleague today, he texted me, he said that he had court and the judge referenced his recent Twitter thread or storm or whatever. So I love ICE. They're great. Don't deport my clients. I will say, okay, I'm not, that's, whatever. It's a slogan, it feels like, and it does feel like there was a time like during Operation Wetback when we didn't have ICE and there were sheriffs doing it, local cops and sheriffs, deporting people suspected of being Mexican. And at some point we said, oh, well, we better push that to the federal level. And if you abolish ICE without fundamentally changing the law, there's always the risk that, they shift it back to INS or gets driven down to the local level. And then you're just in a situation where you have really bad laws just waiting to be enforced by, whoever, which is a little bit what we saw with Obama, Trump. Obama 2014 to 16, lots of discretion, lots of people allowed into the country, lots of people had their cases shelved. And then Trump came in and removed all that discretion. And so, and I have been thinking a little bit just about how unhealthy it's going to be if it continues this way, a back and forth, and what that does to the psyche of people in these communities, and, to have this constant back and forth. But yeah, I'm a big ICE guy, so.
Yeah, no, there has to be a change in the laws. And on the issues that I work on, I've been really happy to see the New Way Forward bill come out as a potential model for how you start to roll back some of these all get traced to the 1996 laws under the Clinton administration that really expanded the criminal grounds for deportation and detention. I think there's been a lot of movement around recognizing the real evil in immigration detention itself. And so I hope we'll see more progressive legislation there as a possibility too. But yeah, on the ground, and the truth is we all have worked with ICE officers in our clients' cases. And I've seen a change in them. I've seen cases where officers, you could tell in their heads, they're like, I don't want to be doing this, but I'm doing this. And there is something about the system itself, the agency itself, that is fundamentally flawed, where you can have folks who believe very differently than I do about the system, who could still be in it and still actually be like, this is wrong. I know it's wrong. I don't want to be doing this, but I am. And that to me is Exhibit A for why that agency has to go. It's not about the people, it's about the system itself, which is set up to really target immigrant communities.
But to be fair, under Obama, there were some ICE officers who were doing that. I really don't want to be doing this, but I have to, and they're letting your client go free. So, you know, there are a lot of ICE officers who really relish what they do.
No, it's definitely true, and it's true for how we think about policing too, about a lot of fundamental issues. But I think at the bottom line is that we have to change the laws and the system, funding structures. It's not just about bad apples. It really is about the system as a whole.
One thing that, oh, sorry. Just, I guess, the last thing. Every time I post on Twitter somewhere about a really sympathetic case, oh, this guy has, you know, been here or whatever for a long time, and now he's being deported or facing deportation. I always get people chiming in saying, well, how come he hasn't applied yet for his green card? And so I always say, if we could just get the immigration system that exists in the minds of conservatives, then we would be on a path to, you know, something just, you know, because in their minds, hey, if you've kind of been here a while, you go down to the paper store and you pay the thing and then you get your green card. And I think that should be the way it is. So, you know, that would go a long ways, and hopefully we get some other positive changes here soon, hopefully. But
hopefully.
I think are we out of time?
We are, yes, thank you.
What a bummer.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. Thank you all for your time and being here with us today. This was a real treat for me to listen to. As for the folks who are at the webinar, a reminder, in the community tab, you can look into the CLE credits if that's something that you are.
We'll do the CLE credits?
Yes,
Oh,
in